listening to Opening the Harp Chakra, the podcast, bringing you beautiful, healing, magical harp music and talking to the artists that create it. I'm your host, Jay Michaels. Today, we wrap up Season 2 of this podcast, a special episode. Our guest, a very well-known musician, composer, singer. She plays several instruments, including the harp, of course. Her career spans over 2 decades. She's sold over 14 million albums. She's won 2 Junos. She's gotten 2 Grammy nominations. She's performed for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. She's a highly successful businesswoman who created her own record label, Quinlan Road. Today, a conversation with Loreena McKennitt. Well, welcome to the podcast, Loreena. Thank you so very much for agreeing to do this.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Great to be able to join you.
Thank you. Well, the purpose of this episode is to discuss an article that you wrote about the music industry, specifically streaming. But before we get to that, perhaps some backstory, if you don't mind. I'd like to ask if you could tell us about your early years in the industry, starting with, and because obviously this is a harp podcast, how you came to play the harp.
Well, let me begin with that. When I was living in Manitoba, I became exposed to Celtic music when I was living in Winnipeg. And there was a wonderful folk club that gathered on a Sunday night, and a number of the members were from Scotland and Ireland and England. And people would come with their vinyl records, or they would know some pieces, and we'd sit around and play and sing and talk about what bands and groups. And one of those recordings was actually one of a harper from Brittany called Alain Stivell. And it was called, I think, Live in Dublin, or the Celtic Harp Renaissance. And then I acquired the Live in Dublin recording. And those 2 recordings were really quite foundational for me, because I realized that up until that point, I hadn't really given a lot of thought about a harp. I mean, certainly becoming exposed to the Celtic music, it's hard to avoid it in one sense. But in another, they're not that commonplace to acquire. So that was really the beginning of me being smitten by Celtic music, and in particular with the harp, more of the Celtic harp.
Was the harp your first instrument?
No, I started off in piano.
Okay.
I started off playing piano at the age of 5, and I studied for about 9 years. I also studied classical voice for about 5. And then I left my classical studies and kind of fell in love with folk music and traditional folk music. And it took me on a great long journey from there.
And you've brought many of us along that great long journey with your music, and we certainly thank you for that. I want to talk about this article you wrote in mid-March of 2021 called "Is the Streaming Experiment Failing Artists?" And I found this a fascinating article, and frankly, a very depressing read as a musician myself. But what inspired you to write the article?
Well, I guess on one hand, I've never been one to suffer quietly.
Okay.
I think what might be informative is going back to the other part of your first question was a bit about the origins of my career.
Okay.
I actually grew up wanting to be a veterinarian. I never believed or dreamed about being a singer. But as I said, I became smitten by the Celtic music.
Right.
And after spending about 4 years at the Shakespearean Festival Theatre here in Stratford, that's when I set off and made my first recording, Elemental. And I borrowed the money from my parents, who had saved this up for my veterinarian studies. It was $10,000. And I made Elemental in 1 week. There was a studio in a barn not far from Stratford. And I asked the engineer when we were through recording, did he know of some, what happens next in the process? So I ran off some cassettes, and I went down to the St. Lawrence Market in Toronto, and I busked on the street, and I built up a following, and including people would go into retail shops asking for my recordings. Soon those retailers were phoning me in Stratford, which is about 90 miles away, asking me if I would leave some with them on consignment. And this whole picture grew in a very organic kind of way from about 1985 to 1991. And through that period of time, I had to learn the nuts and bolts of the music industry. I didn't have a manager. I never have had a manager. So I've always had to figure things out for myself and do it for myself. And I could see this great interplay that of the role actually that many parties played in the success of a recording. That is, success what didn't come just down to the creative footprint, but it was this ecosystem that I discovered, beginning with the engineer and the studio and all their suppliers, the photographer, the graphic designer, the caterer, the then you get into retail and the newspapers and the college stations, and it just went on and on. I mean, I remember writing another piece that listed about 25 or 30 service providers in this ecosystem. So I got to be embedded in that ecosystem, and time moved on. In '91, I signed a licensing deal with the Warner Music Group. I signed it directly with Warner Canada, but it came to the Warner Group all over the world. And that's really when my career took off in a significant way and reached its height around 1998. But during those years, in the 90s, of course, we could see in the far distance and then the looming distance, computers and the internet creeping up ever closely, not really knowing what its impact, whether it would be good or bad, or would all of a sudden expand all kinds of creative possibilities and so on. But I do, when I look back on it now, I mean, I resisted email. I
Wow.
resisted email because I cherish the personal experience so much.
Sure.
But it was really what the catalyst of writing that article was, seeing in my lifetime and having lived and died by the sword, shall we say, my own little business, little international business, I could see very intimately what was happening, what was working, what was not working, and certainly what happened after the internet came in. There was a real Wild West period where music was available for free. And there was almost a generation that got accustomed to free. And then there was a scrambling around. Well, there had to be better than that. Apple had tried to retain the old business model where artists might be paid, let's say 25 cents per song. That got destroyed really through the free, and then the evolution of the streaming and Spotify.
Mm-hmm.
And so that the remuneration for artists can be like 10 cents per thousand plays. I mean, this is a slightly antiquated number, but it hasn't changed drastically. Only now in this past year we see some move. But so if you think 10 cents per thousand plays, or on YouTube, and you get paid 0.00013 cents per play, they're just simply, it broke half of the business model, which meant there's touring and there's commodifying your music. And it literally broke the commodification, except for some very, very high end artists, let's say at the Justin Bieber scale. But that ecosystem that I grew up with, my career grew up with, including a printers here in Stratford. We used to print tens of thousands of cassette and then CD booklets here. And it was I think it was the biggest account they had. And so when this all came in, a lot of these smaller businesses could not sustain a business model that was paying the creators and the producers so very little.
So bootlegging started long ago. People copied, cassettes or copied songs off the radio. But when the digital age started, that made that all so much easier, right, for people to copy music and
Yes, anytime I mean, analog, and, even though you can do that on an industrial scale, still moving things around or selling them on a beach is still far more cumbersome than, let's say, I remember seeing a BitTorrent website that was, they're all about music for free, and their business model, they were selling the real estate around the periphery of their website. This was an older one before we got into the selling data era, which we're in now. But I remember just being alarmed seeing my whole catalog, including the videos of No Journey's End and so on, and being downloaded. And there was a little counter at the bottom of the page that said in the past, I don't know, it was about a week or something, 5,000 illegal downloads had taken place. And I thought to myself, wow, imagine every week of the year, multiply that times the number of these kinds of sites. And it was just really, really, there's no other way than to say it was highway robbery.
Indeed. Yeah. Wow. I see on your website that your music is on Spotify by default.
Yes, I made a note to myself, in fact, this morning about just trying to keep people abreast of, because what has happened, that ecosystem, and in particular, the bricks and mortar retailers have disappeared, and it's shaken down to be really, if you are dealing with analog items, it's Amazon. There might be still, I don't know, Barnes and Noble. Up here, we call it Indigo and Chapters. But there's very, very few places you can actually buy a physical product. We found that a lot of our listeners still do like physical items. They like to look through the booklets, and they like the whole experience. But the runaway, unregulated industry of the internet, and particularly in our case, streaming, there was no way that these retailers could survive. So there's a kind of stark choice for artists now. Either you have to play the game. I call it the forced march. Every day I talk about the forced march. That you actually don't have a choice. Well, you do have a choice. You can either pack up your career, or you get in bed with these players who are just simply not playing fair and equitable. And so I've said to myself, I resisted going on Spotify for many years. And then it just, you starve yourself to the point where you say, okay, I'll go on, but I'm going to write this disclaimer and says, I'm here by default. And I highly encourage people to go and buy a physical product from their local retailer, from their artist, if they possibly can.
Yeah, because once the the sales started to diminish. I know for a lot of musicians, well, then we went to digital downloads, but then that just seemed to go away so quickly and went just to everything became streaming.
That's right. I mean, the streaming model put such pressure on the downloads that Apple was doing, charging which was very close to the old business model of, on a vinyl or a CD, artists would be paid somewhere in the vicinity of 25 cents per song. Once free came along, like with Napster and so on, then followed by Spotify and other streaming services that pay, 10 cents per thousand songs, the download model couldn't compete. And so I could see Apple hanging on for a while, but then they just had to, abandon that model.
Yeah. Do you see a way out of this for the music industry, or do you think this is just the way it's going to be?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it seems every day there's, I mean, if one looks at from a wider lens, I think there's good news. It's not coming fast enough as far as I'm concerned, but I think there's good news, because I think that people are starting to appreciate that they've been, in some way, they've been scammed, and partially to do with the current business model, of which, I mean, now the most recent, one of the most recent events is this Apple Facebook data thing, where Apple's saying, no, we're going to ask our customers if they want to be followed and their information. And this is probably one of the most egregious things of the way the whole industry has been built. It's been built on taking people's information without their knowledge and without their permission. And so I see that, but I see, in a broader sense, regulation is coming in, and Europe has been, whether it's from privacy or from proper paying of content providers, copyright, those kinds of things. I see more regulation coming in, and the tighter that goes, the better. And I think that it continues to be a massive public awareness and education exercise to say, if you still want your music around, let's say in the music world, we all need to have to understand the business model in which we're living in. So I do see some hope, but I don't see it perhaps in time for some artists who deserve to have a career. For myself, I'm fine. My career has been a fairly long one and a fairly successful one. So I'm less concerned for myself than I am for other artists, and frankly, for the general music loving public who it's kind of like sometimes it feels to me like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, that the DDT is the new DDT in the music world is the digital thing. And it's really killing off genres of music because you can have a lot of young people playing the music of whatever genre and extremely well. But if there isn't a business model, a predictable business model to commodify that, to make a living out of it, they'll do it in their late teens, early 20s, and then they want to get married, have a family, and they go on and do something else. So there simply isn't presently a strong business environment to be in this industry unless you're, Spotify and Google Play.
Yeah. So what would you say to fans of music? What can they do to help?
I think the first thing is really take your curiosity for a walk and find out as much as you can. Study a bit about, if you can, of the or listen to about the way the business model is. It's a pretty dry subject, but I think there are many industries actually, and people in those businesses and industries that are needing this kind of comprehension. I think the more obvious thing is for music is try to find, if an artist, you can go directly to the artist for what you're looking, if you can buy from them directly, and if not, try to find a non-Amazon retailer that you can buy from. And then if all else fails, buy a CD from Amazon. It's kind of, and then work your way down like that. I mean, and I think the other thing is in a different domain, if this is a subject that you're interested and concerned, do speak to your elected representatives and say, look, we want a fair deal for creators, and they can be musical creators, they can be other kinds of content creators, could be film creators, but anything that can be digitized has pretty much been slammed by a lack of protection and regulation over the past 2 decades. And so I think it's always good to use your democratic voice and speak to your elected representatives and say, we're aware that creators are not being properly compensated, and we want to see that.
So whether you're a consumer or a musician, you can certainly use that talk to your representatives, try to affect change that way. And I suppose if you're a musician, make sure you have availability for people to purchase your music directly from you. I think that's an important piece of advice there.
If you can, I have to say that that's how I started my career. And I was so lucky to be living in an analog era. As I mentioned, I went down to Toronto on Saturdays and busked and sold my cassettes at the market. And then I set up accounts, and people would contact me, and I would go off to the UPS or whatever and send off cassettes and CDs and so on. So whatever the contemporary equivalent is, through Bandcamp or in PayPal, I'm not sure all the avenues, but I would definitely try to stay as close to your customer as you possibly can. But it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you for that good advice. I appreciate it. In the fall of 2019, you said that you intend to lean against the threats posed by global warming and the harmful effects of technology. How's
that going?
How's that going? Yeah, if I can ask that. Yeah.
Well, 2019, yes, that seems light years away now.
Right, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, yeah, we got off that tour in November of 2019, had Christmas. I took a little break and took a train trip up to Churchill, Manitoba in February. And then when came back, we were slammed straight into the pandemic. And that kind of put slowed things down a lot around uh, our shop, shall we say, a bit of recalibrating to be done, and some other things in my personal world. I'd also hoped to have taken some time for myself, and to the degree that that was possible, went camping and canoeing and a few other things. Um, we were just getting ramped up to get back into the swing of things. And then last November, where I live, there was the plans for a very, very, very large float glass plant. And I ended up in the absolute epicenter of that controversy here in Stratford. And we kind of wrapped it up at the end of February. And now I would say we've also spent the past 2 months really looking again if we can improve our circumstances of getting closer to our customer. We examined, could we, so this is going back to the music business, uh, was there a way that we could get around a lot of Amazon, frankly? And we invested a lot of time exploring all manner of things, but it didn't seem to really bring about fruit. So in the meantime, when we launched this, or when I was in part of this this local controversy, we launched an entity that I had been ruminating on for a few years, going back to technology and the climate, and it's called Wise Communities. And so we're kind of our days go back, or in weeks go back and forth, a bit in the music business, and what are we doing, how are we strengthening doing things, including upgrading our website, but also how are we leaning against the wheel to do with climate change. For me personally, I live on a farm, and we've been in the process of planting thousands of trees there. But we're also trying to assist the local community in their efforts here. So it's, I think I'm just one person of many people around the globe that is looking at how do we make stronger and better choices, and also how do we really address this urgent climate issue.
Well, thank you for your good work in that and your inspiration. The Stolen Child Project. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, the Stolen Child Project is sort of came to be, I don't know, about 5 years. I can't remember now. I just know that I've been studying. Well, as we've been talking on this in this gathering, you and I,
Right.
that I've seen the downside of the technology with respect to my music and profession and career and so on. And there have been upsides of the technology, I will also confess, so it's not all bad. But I also had occasion to start studying technology with respect to child and human development. And um, I was really alarmed at what I was learning. And when one tour, when I was singing "The Stolen Child" with the Yeats poem that I set to music back in 1985, I thought that's really what it's like. Children's childhood is in some cases being stolen, not completely, but with a great deal of involvement with respect to the unintended consequences of technology. And when you look at the various kinds of, and it's fascinating, you look at teenagers and how the gender split, where girls, they will often use, because they're more social, to be using it for, they might abuse it in terms of bullying and suicide. Boys tend to get more into gaming and hard porn. But there's a loss of real communication skills. there's all kinds of detrimental effects to do with vision. I know there's a Dr. Eric Sigmund out of the UK who wrote a paper for the European Commission a few years ago who lists over 26 pages a lot of the detrimental physical and mental effects of the technology not being used in a wise way. So it was something I really wanted to illuminate, shall we say. I'm certainly not the expert by any stretch. I'm fascinated by the subject, and I just like to consider myself as a conduit for those experts, such as Dr. Gordon Neufeld or Dr. Leonard Sachs, Dr. Nicholas Kadaris, who's written a book called Glow Kids on addiction. Um, yeah, there's also a wonderful film called Screenagers, which is an excellent tool to open the discussion between, let's say, students or youth and their parents on the downside of the technology. So that's a bit of the background there.
Oh, thank you. Well, we'll include a link to that in our show notes where people can find out more about the Stolen Child Project. We'll also include a link to your website, LoreenaMcKennitt.com, where one can find out more about you and read your articles, purchase your music. In the remaining time we have, can I ask you a few more harp questions? That'd be okay.
Sure.
Yeah. How many harps do you have right now?
Oh, I think I have
Okay.
5, but that is, yes, I think that's about 5.
Yeah. They're different brands or pretty much the same harp? Or?
Pretty much the
Yeah.
same one. Yeah. They were I gathered them because partially out of prudence, that if something happened to one because I need it for performance, we for many years we toured with two
Mm-hmm.
harps, one as a backup. There was one tour where I toured with 2 harps, one because one was tuned in one key and the other was tuned in a different key in flats. So one was
Oh,
in
yeah.
flats, the other was in sharps. So.
That's smart. Yeah. Your thoughts on the harp as a magical instrument?
Well, it really is. It strikes me when I have the too rare opportunity to hear harp music, but somebody else playing harp. Um, it's a very, it is a very magical. It's a very soothing instrument. I think the only other instrument that I can, in my view, comes close is actually the oud,
Oh.
the instrument, but or lute, shall we
Mm-hmm.
say? But the harp is yeah, it beckons all those cliched
Sure, it does,
words.
doesn't it? Yeah.
I won't go on and say ethereal, but
Well, but
why
it
not?
is. Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
is.
And a healing instrument as well, right? I mean, there's so much going on now. And I cover this a lot in the podcast about the healing aspects of harp and talk to a lot of people that use it therapeutically.
Yeah.
It's just something.
It is. And I mean, it's a fascinating study, music in itself. I've often felt that music is like an oral pharmacy. And depending on what mood you're in or you want to stay in, you can choose between different genres, but you can also choose between different instruments. And the impact of a piano, let's say, which is a hammered instrument on strings versus a harp, is just night and day. And and I'd love to understand more of the science and the physiology of it. But what we do observe is that the harp is a very, very soothing instrument.
Yeah, it certainly is. There's something about the fingers touching the strings, plucking the strings directly, and that sound box vibrating. It's quite a combination of things. And then the emotion. I think for people listening, it's very healing. It's very magical. For the player, to me, I always think of it as alchemy, that you take your emotions and whatever you're going through and you take this instrument and you kind of make gold with it.
Yes, it is. It's a very specific taste. The harp. I mean, I know that, and it has such a different quality, let's say, than a bowed instrument like the
Mm-hmm.
cello, um, which is perhaps more like the
Like the
human
voice, right?
voice.
Yeah. But in the two of them together, are just beautiful.
They're
I so much enjoyed the tour where the three of you went out, and
okay.
actually I saw you in New Hampshire, and just the interplay between the instruments, but the harp and the cello together is there's just a beautiful alchemy there.
Oh,
Yeah.
good, good. No, and Caroline is such a beautiful
She
cellist.
is great. Yeah, we had a chance to chat with her a little bit after the show, and she's just wonderful. I thanked her for her bowing lessons online because I found them very helpful. So
That's
yeah.
great.
Well, Loreena McKennitt, I'm so grateful that you agreed to come and do this. I know you've been taking kind of a break from some things, and for you to come and talk to us and me on this podcast, it's greatly appreciated. And I just thought it was important. This article, I just wanted to talk more about it and get your personal one-to-one take on it, and I appreciate that very much.
Well, I appreciate you reaching out, and I wish all your listeners the very, very best in these very challenging times.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and continued success. And we'll be
Thank you. And
listening to your music again one day, I hope.
yes, God willing, we'll be out on the road. Who knows?
All right. Well, thank you so much, Loreena McKennitt.
Thank you, Jay. Bye bye.
If you have questions or guest suggestions, please email me at openingtheharpchakra@yahoo.com. We've also included links to PayPal and Venmo if you'd like to contribute to the production of this podcast. In the coming weeks, Season 3, with more beautiful harp music from around the world. I'm your host, Jay Michaels. Once again, thank you so much. Peace. Namaste.